Hey, what's good, family? Sometimes life has a way of going from 0 to 100 hella quick, but the fact is that you're here, I'm here, and we're going to explore something that is interesting to me. So some of you may or may not have heard of Splice, and Splice is a really neat, potentially neat thing that you can go online and find some samples, download them for a subscription service, and then add them to your own library for further use. And a typical practice with that would be to, download something like kicks and snares, to throw them in, make a little beat like this, and then you're like, yeah, I'm good to go. I got my, super track. But for me, something that I like to do is I consider this a neat opportunity to take someone's samples from another artist and kind of figure out how they work or what the characteristics are without having to try to pull it from the context of a song. So typically you would hear something like this from Disproves and, a drum and bass track, and it would all have all the elements playing together, and you're trying to sit there and dissect, is it in mono, what part of the, what's EQ'd out, or how is this mixed, how is this compressed? And sometimes it's kind of difficult to hear or isolate that without, isolate it with all of the other elements happening at once. So I'm working on some pretty heavy drums right here, and this is how they sound. Actually, I'm kind of proud of these, so let's listen to how they sound just vanilla. This is Superior Drummer 3. And then we go into this processing, and this is what it sounds like. Big difference, right? So now using that, I can kind of compare that to something from, someone I look up to, which is Disprove, and be like, all right, well, how does it sound in comparison? And this is what we have. Okay, now first things first. One thing that you want to keep in mind is that you don't want to try to compare so hard that you are putting yourself in this horrible bind of oh, why can't I sound exactly like this person? And the point of this video isn't to make stuff or make a kick and snare that sound identical to this. However, there are some key things that we can try to pull out in order to kind of make this, in order to try to make my stuff sound a little bit closer as compared to what I'm doing normally. So let's go ahead and add a couple of tools, and we can kind of take a look from there. The first thing that I'm going to pull up is an EQ. And the reason why is because I want to look at the frequency content that each of these have, because for me these sound so good that you can, they're already supposed to be able to, ideally I guess you can just throw these samples into a song and they should relatively work with minor EQ, right? So if that's the case, then let's take a look at what Disprove himself is doing and how this kind of looks on a frequency spectrum. So this is really interesting because, for one, look how loud this is. But the other thing to keep in mind is that the low end is actually preserved. It's just shelved. So this particular snare is looking like it's at D sharp, and that means that if I were to tune my drums to that same particular frequency, then I can kind of have a closer point of reference. But before I do that, I'm also going to look at the kick as well. And this is what it looks like. You can tell that there's a little bit of low, mid end with some notching here, and then the frequency of this is relatively, let me see. So it's kind of hard to tell sometimes with kicks because you have this these are all jumbled up together, and the frequency differences between these are much smaller as opposed to these peaks, but it's telling me that it's also in D sharp. So I guess we can kind of, sure, wait, it was here. So that means that these two are both tuned the same, but they are not from the same song, so that doesn't necessarily mean that that's how it's going to be in the track. But with that in mind, I can kind of basically take the frequency content from here, right, and I can try to make my kick kind of have a similar feel to what this looks like and pay attention to the frequency spectrum. You can tell that there's some stuff that is rolled off here of everything below 34 hertz, but it's not entirely just it's not brick walled, so to speak. So it wouldn't just be a low cut that looks like this that a lot of people do. It's more so a relatively sharp roll that kind of would look something like this. Now the other thing to keep in mind is that this particular instance here of these are pushed up by quite a bit. So if I were to do that on my own and everything else is kind of flattened out, that would tell me that I can basically boost the fundamental of my kick on its own right. So with that being said, let me turn this off and then we can kind of look at the imager section, and let's look at what's happening as far as this. So the kick is almost completely in mono. There might be just a little tiny bit, yeah, on that high end. Let me look at the also on here as well, but the fundamental should be, yeah, that's completely mono. And so is the low mids. Let's go ahead and look at the snare now, and let's see how this looks. Some stereo information, some fuzz on that, super wide, all over the place. So you can also hear that within this there is this, and what that would tell me is that more than likely on top of the snare some white noise was added to kind of give it that splash feel. It could also be a hi-hat, but to me it sounds like it's probably a mix of both. So how does that compare to my stuff? Let's go ahead and listen. Okay, so first off, let me try to go in here and shorten the transient of this, and that might help give us just a closer point of reference. Let me see here. And then probably this one as well. Now something to keep in mind is that there is some, it sounds like somewhere, yes, there's some reverb on this here at the beginning, so let's see how this sounds kind of dry. There is a little bit of that crisp top end, so maybe I can add something that is, nope, not that, and maybe a little bit louder. Now we have a little bit of noise. And I'm going to go ahead and duplicate that and then move that over. So that way we can have just a little bit of high end in our kick and snare as well. The other thing to keep in mind is that the information on these, the tuning is different. So let's go ahead and have a look at this as well. So here's my kick, which also shows me D#2, which is cool. But notice how on all of this, my high end is much louder than the rest of my stuff. So what that would mean is that essentially, if I take a really wide thing here and I just leave that, that should potentially clean up my kick. Now, because I also have the snare on here, I can't just do that and get away with it, but okay. So the next thing to look at would be kind of just, and again, I'm not trying to make it sound so similar, but that's kind of one thing to take care of as far as that information. And then also the transient on that is way harder. You guys kind of see where I'm going with this though, right? You can kind of gauge and compare this between somebody that has made something that you listen to versus like the kind of stuff that you make on your own. So if I look at this, fundamentals mono, there's a little bit of stereo information on there and a little bit of splash, and then that's completely open. So I'm already kind of in the relative ballpark of making this sound how I want it. Now one other thing that we can look at is that I was talking about from before is the transient. So if I duplicate this and flatten this out, come on, and flatten, then you can kind of see how the transient of this is a little bit smaller than this. If we go into this a little bit deeper, you can see that this is more of a square tone, and this is still kind of, I guess, relatively sine wavy. That's more of a square there, even there, and then eventually it kind of smooths out. But even so, this is much bigger than this. And what that tells me is that when going back and working on my transient, I need to probably add a little bit more distortion for that beginning point. And so if I wanted to, I can kind of go back and make that a little bit harder on the transient itself and also add in a little bit more distortion. Now, one thing I want to keep in mind is that if I over distort it, then it's also going to affect the rest of the sound. So I can try something that's like a transient shaper first or whatever to try to troubleshoot that problem, if that makes sense. Regarding the snare, mine is here, and his sounds like this. So the first thing that I would do as far as matching pitch would be to take a look at this with an EQ. Oops. And just try to look at what is happening. So that's a C4. So if I pitch that up by one semitone, that should be relatively similar. And I know that when you're tuning drums, typically you don't want to do this because it doesn't, how do I say, the way that this pitches isn't quite the same as if you were to do it with a frequency shifter, but it's okay. Anyways, I'm not going to get too far into the details of that. I can save it for another video. But now that this is kind of like a little bit higher in pitch, I can take a look at how this looks. And that is the picture that we're looking at. Now, as far as this goes, let's take a look at this. Okay, and let me play it from here. And let's see how this looks. So it actually doesn't look that different, as opposed to the fundamental is accentuated and then the high end kind of gets higher and higher from here. So if I were to try to EQ that on mine, what I would try to do is basically follow the same suit of and looking at what's going on. So not only is this not as loud, but the curvature here is like, this is kind of matched up to that. So I'd want to shelf that here. And then I would want to take something like this and give this entire thing a boost to where it's the highest at this point. I also might want to boost that as well. And then maybe take another one, kind of lower that here. Make that a little sharper. And then of course you can kind of like tell where this is going. So I can kind of basically use this as a means to make this sound somewhat similar. Now that's a really high boost. So as opposed to trying to EQ the hell out of this and force those frequencies up, I'd go back and try to add more high end and distortion and maybe layer this with some white noise instead. But you can kind of get a means of like what I'm going for here. And beyond that, you know, you can compare that to the stereo information and all that stuff. And there's other components that you can basically compare that to in order to kind of start to shape your own stuff. And it doesn't have to be with drums. Drums are a great example, but you can also do it with basses. Like dissecting a bass is really important because it kind of pertains to how you fit it inside of a track like this. So like, let's say I'm trying to make, you know, a drum and bass track. Well, one main thing that I want to try to pay attention to is like, where does it sit in the stereo field? There are some other things too of like, you know, separating your sub and all that stuff too. But if I were to look at something here, let me see if there's any basses on this. None from aeonnhp. Let's take a look at this bass loop from Echo. Alright, well that's a pretty common sound. So what I can look at is not only the waveform, which looks like here. What does this sound like? Hold on. Okay, that's just an oscillation. But also the frequency content of how they might try to apply it in their own tunes. So on this, look at this. This is interesting. There's a huge dip here in this region. So there's a giant curvature that goes like this. Something like that. And that's being notched out. Hold on, let me see if this moves. No, it doesn't. So within this is kind of like what we're looking at as far as like how to EQ or how to make this sound really good. Because this is kind of like a sub, you know, bass. but this is kind of the shape that I might try to go for whenever I'm trying to make a sound like this and apply it in my own track. Now let's go ahead and again look at the stereo image and see how that pertains. So there is stereo information in the sub, stereo information on the low mids, fuzzy in the high mids, and super here. So it's kind of interesting because, you know, a typical practice that you might hear is to keep the sub in mono, right? But look at this. There's still some movement within that. So if I were to completely throw this in mono, let's see what happens. Let me turn all that off. It doesn't quite have the amount of power or energy that you might think or suspect. So whenever I'm going and designing my own like sub recess or whatever, I can kind of keep that in mind and not have to worry about throwing this in mono so hard. I can just kind of take a low end of this on a frequency split and then kind of pull that down. Or I can basically take an ozone and do the same thing. So I can go here. I mean, this doesn't need any work, but let's say I'm working on the lows and let's say it's like super spread out from a Reese, then instead of putting it completely in mono, I can just drag that down and then drag that down a little bit and then push that up and then push that up a little bit. That's a little far. But does that make sense to you guys? So, you know, Splice is really cool and it is a great way to gain inspiration, but if you're a sound designer and you make your own stuff, then this is a really good way to analyze other people's, I guess, sound design stuff in its own right. And it's neat because you don't have to try to key this stuff out while listening to the entire thing in context, because with all the other elements playing, it's difficult to kind of isolate, even if you use like an EQ of like meticulous surgically things so that you try to isolate the sound like I know some of us have done before. But I hope that you guys have found this video helpful. I think that it's something that's really interesting. It's going to help me as far as my future sound design. Yeah, I hope that you guys get something out of it. Thank you so much for watching my content, and I'm really excited to kind of share some future stuff with you guys. This same project file you'll be seeing again in future videos of how to make your drums like this, although I'm going to keep working on it and make it a little bit closer towards the people that I'm trying to sound like. And then I'm also covering some FM8 stuff in the future, which is going to be cool. Some really cool like monster sounds and stuff. Hold on, what does it sound like? Yeah, so let me tame those beasts and then I will be sure to upload some videos and show you how all that processing is done. But anyways, thanks again guys, take care, and happy producing.